Welcome to this morning's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, Giorgio, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. It's really an honor to moderate today's discussion. We are very fortunate today to have two top experts on the Middle East talking about the trip that Joe Biden is going to be making this month to Israel, Palestine, as well as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I want to quickly introduce our two experts before we get started. We have Linda Robinson, who is the director of the Center for Middle East Public Policy and a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, where she has been since 2013. Linda is an author, public speaker, and prize-winning former foreign correspondent who has over 30 years of experience in multiple regions, including the Middle East and South Asia. She has testified before Congress on multiple occasions. And prior to joining RAND, Linda worked as a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Today's second expert is Stephen Cook, who is a senior fellow for Middle East and Africa Studies at Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen is a leading expert on Arab and Turkish affairs, as well as US foreign policy in the Middle East. He is the author of several books about the region, and today the Los Angeles Times actually published a piece by Stephen titled, excuse me one quick second, I want to get the exact title of the article, "Why is Biden's Middle East Trip Even Necessary?" Stephen, if I may, I would like to actually begin today's event by asking you the exact question that you asked in the title of your LA Times piece. Why is this trip even necessary? Could you please share your thoughts on this visit that Biden will be making?
Well, thanks very much, Giorgio. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks to Patrick Costello, and it's great to be with Linda. Linda and I do this, I think, pretty often. We should just take it on the road and make it a show. Look, I think that the administration is making the argument that the trip is important. The president wants to go to Israel. He doesn't want to be confronted with, not having gone to Israel. He wants to be there to express on the ground his ironclad commitment to Israeli security. And then when he travels to Bethlehem to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, he's going to say that he supports the two-state solution. And then, of course, the big deal, he's going to go to the GCC+3 meeting in Jeddah, and they're making the case that this is, the president demonstrating America's commitment to the region and, a regional coalition to meet the Iranian challenge as the United States is occupied with a war in Europe and the rising challenge of China in Asia. The United States is helping our partners manage the Iranian challenge. And I think the argument that I made in the LA Times is that, one, expressing ironclad commitment to Israeli security is something that all presidents do all the time. There's no real compelling reason to go. And that when he goes out to the West Bank and says that he supports the two-state solution, there's really no evidence that he does. Sure, the Biden administration deserves credit for reestablishing aid to the Palestinian Authority, but essentially has bought the Israeli story about narrowing the conflict, which is a nicer way of saying economic peace, which is no peace at all. So he doesn't have a lot of credibility on the question of two-state solution. No American politician really does. And then in terms of regional security, the United States is essentially playing catch up here. These countries in the region, Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, have forged a regional consensus that goes back actually many, many years now, and have been cooperating, but only since the Abraham Accords have been really willing to put it on the table. And that the United States, this has happened. This kind of regional consensus and this coalition that has developed has happened not as a result of American efforts, but despite American efforts. The United States has been outside the regional consensus on Iran in its drive to first negotiate the JCPOA, and then with this administration's efforts to rejoin the JCPOA. And going back to 2003, the Bush administration's effort to promote democracy in the region, and then subsequently President Obama's efforts to do the same after the Arab uprisings. So now the administration, confronted with the fact that there's a new JCPOA, it seems unlikely, there's at least on life support, is seeking to kind of rejoin this regional consensus. It's welcome, but I think the kicker is that countries in the region are looking for more than just words from the United States. And then the question is, what can the administration do that will pass muster in Congress? And I think that that's a real trap, political trap for the president. So what's he really going about? He's going about oil and gas prices. All of this could have been avoided with a 10-minute phone call to the Saudis, including the Crown Prince, months ago. It would have been a painful news cycle for about a day or two, but the president wouldn't look like he's going hat in hand, which is not the point of presidential visits. Sorry to be the skunk at the party.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. Linda, I want to turn to you. Stephen is obviously making reference to the fact that there has not really been any direct engagement between President Biden and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Now he's going to be going to the kingdom this week and meeting with the Crown Prince. Obviously, this has been an extremely difficult relationship. This meeting is, him going to the kingdom is in itself very controversial. I wanted to ask if you can tell us your thoughts on the current state of relations between Mohammed bin Salman and this administration, and how you think this trip to Saudi Arabia by the US president can impact this very delicate relationship.
Thanks, Giorgio. It's great to be with all of you, and again with Stephen. I think that I need to address more broadly the argument that Stephen just made as well, but I will give you a brief reply on the Saudi question. Clearly, it's an awkward moment, and the administration is saying we are going to recalibrate, where we don't intend to rupture the relationship with Saudis. It's an 80-year-old relationship, a strategic partnership. And I think that the US-Saudi issue is going to dominate, that has been dominating and will dominate the news coverage. But I think that it's important to see beyond that. And it's not just about oil. It is about recognizing the weight that Saudi Arabia plays in the region. And that necessitates, I believe, a policy of balancing values and interests. So there's been an awkward attempt to try to put that narrative out in advance of this trip. But I think it's important, as Stephen's last point in his very cogent argument was that this could have been accomplished. If it was just about oil, it could have been accomplished with a phone call, but it's not. And I think it's really important to see there's a strategic purpose to this trip. And the larger frame here is that the narrative in the region has been the US is pivoting away. I've been out in the region for 3 extended trips this year. We organized a roundtable, closed door event precisely to ask regional players and partners what they want from the US, what they're willing to do for themselves, and what prospects are for regional security cooperation. And so what the administration, they haven't really articulated this as a strategy. I will reference our study last year, Reimagining US Strategy in the Middle East. The trick here is to get away from the 20 years of the US heavy military action and engagement, a lot of unproductive investment, and not pivot away entirely, because the US has very substantial interest in the region, but reshape its approach. And that approach really involves the region doing more for itself collectively. And this is something that we have actually 3 interesting opportunities right now that the president will be addressing and that have been happening. I would disagree with Stephen that the Abraham Accords just happened on their own. Of course, he knows very well the quid pro quos the Trump administration offered to get these parties to come to the table. But, and as we said in our peace dividend analysis last year, it has great potential for regional integration. What is happening now, I believe, is something that can be built upon, but not without US participation. I actually think the 2 biggest risks to the 3 opportunities are US inattention, because there are lots of divisions and disputes among these various regional players, and they will rely on certain inputs from the US. And the other one is the lack of any movement on the Palestinian file. And it's not just because certain Arab countries care about it, and it is a declared US policy, which Stephen is right, we're not doing enough about that now, and the conditions aren't propitious, but the place can blow up again. And I've spent time in the West Bank, and the UN Security Coordinator has been sounding the alarm that the situation has again become very unstable. But it's hard to make progress on that, but I believe Saudi Arabia will hold that out as its condition for joining the normalization process. What we're going to get in this trip is touching on, and I'll just briefly mention the 3 opportunities. Of course, the GCC meeting is the putative reason for going to Saudi Arabia. It will include Egypt, Iraq, and Jordan. So it's a broader collective, and this has been tried before and thought about, but expanding the GCC to a wider community and gathering around the table to talk about the security needs, collective security options, and it will include very much what is going to happen if there is no return to JCPOA, and trying to fashion something of a united approach. The other related effort is the Integrated Air and Missile Defense Initiative, which has been very much part of what Central Command has been pushing and for years talking about, not just individual missile defense systems, but a multi-layered integrated system to provide more protection for the region. And that is a defensive project that Congress, in fact, there's a bipartisan bicameral proposal called the Defend Act that is actually supportive of that and requires the Defense Department to build out a plan for supporting that within, I think it's 180 days, but it's moving already. And the third effort comes out of the Abraham Accords, and it's the Negev Forum that has been formed with the meeting, and Tony Blinken went there to the summit in the desert. And what that did for the first time was pivot from a bunch of bilateral accords to a multilateral process. And those countries, which involve not only the Abraham Accord signatories, but Egypt, very importantly, and I understand Jordan may join into this as well. So you get all of the normalizers together working on not just security, but it's a whole multi-faceted approach that includes food, water, energy, tourism, and it does not leave off the Palestinian issues. That is part of the agenda. They've had the first steering committee meeting in Bahrain. The US and Bahrain will lead the Security Cooperation Working Group. They're going to have a formal meeting of the working groups in September and a summit before the end of the year with the ministers, and an annual process. So this is what we're talking about with the regional security architecture. And none of these, there are a lot of problems with Israel for the rest of the Arab countries right now. I think you'll get some normalizers coming along. But with these three opportunities, you begin to see the possibility that the region will come together and start addressing some of these problems together with the US in support, but no longer the US in the lead. And I think that is a welcome development.
Thank you. Stephen, as Linda was talking about the Abraham Accords, I want to talk or ask you about the future of Arab-Israeli normalization deals. Obviously, the four Arab states, UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, that normalized relations with Israel in 2020, that was a real highlight of Trump's foreign policy in the Middle East. Obviously, the Biden administration wants to build on that and sort of expand the scope of the Abraham Accords. I'm wondering, in your opinion, what can we expect Biden to be able to possibly achieve in relation to this goal? And how will this visit impact the Abraham Accords?
Thanks, Giorgio. I think it's important for everybody to understand that there's a lot of overselling going on in some respects with regard to the Abraham Accords. First is the American role in the Abraham Accords, which was basically to seal the deal with the promise of copious amounts of weapons to the Emiratis in particular, and offsets to the Israelis. This was really an Israeli and Emirati project. Those countries had been wanting to normalize for 5 years, and they found a formula in which to do it. I think the Trump administration did, in keeping with the precedent that we set with the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, made it lucrative for American defense contractors, and essentially provided a payoff for the two parties to normalize. Now, in terms of, certainly the Biden administration would like to build on it. And again, we shouldn't oversell the American role in something like the Negev Summit. This was something that Yair Lapid, who's now the prime minister of Israel, when he was the foreign minister, engineered. Of course, these countries want to have the United States there, but this was something that happened not because of the United States, but because the parties themselves wanted to do it. If there was an American role, it was cajoling the Egyptians to go. But again, I wouldn't make too big a deal of the American role, nor would I make too big a deal of the invitation to the Palestinians. The Bahrainis, the Emiratis, the Israelis were all very cool to this idea. They're doing it because the United States has picked it up. When it comes to Biden's trip, I think that the idea is that in some way the Saudis will make a public gesture towards normalization. And they've been signaling that that's probably going to be some sort of aviation agreement. I mean, it's important. The president is going to fly directly from Tel Aviv to Jeddah. That's never happened before. President Trump flew from Riyadh to Tel Aviv, but it's never happened before. When U.S. officials fly from Israel to Saudi Arabia, the plane pretends to land in Jordan, and then it goes up again, and it goes on to Saudi Arabia. This is the first time that will happen. And then subsequently, there'll probably be some announcement that Israeli airliners traveling to Asia can traverse Saudi airspace, and possibly Palestinian citizens of Israel or West Bank Palestinians can fly directly to Jeddah for the pilgrimage. But, in terms of, and that will be an important step towards normalization, but there won't be much more than that, because the Palestinian issue remains unresolved. King Salman remains alive and opposed to normalization until the situation there is resolved. And unlike the Emiratis or the Bahrainis, Crown Prince Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, although he has, I think, a significant reservoir of support, he also has a problem in that Saudi Arabia is a much bigger population with my diversified views on this issue. So I don't think we're going to get much more in the way of that. But let's also be clear that the Saudis are a virtual signatory to the Abraham Accords. You can fly from Dubai or Manama to Israel. That requires Saudi permission. There are IDF representatives in Bahrain that requires Saudi permission. But I don't think that they're going to be willing to go much more than that. The Qataris have been a little more forward-leaning than they've been in the past. They signed an agreement with the Israelis allowing Israeli diamond traders to operate in Doha. And Oman has, publicly hosted Israeli prime ministers, most recently, I believe in 2018, when it hosted Prime Minister Netanyahu. But I don't think the Biden administration is going to get much more than what they've got so far. And they should work with that. Sure. The Negev Summit is an important thing. They should continue to do that. It's a good thing that's it's now going to be an annual thing. But again, we shouldn't oversell what the American role is here. These countries all have a compelling interest on their own to get together. I don't have a problem with nurturing that. I just don't think it requires a presidential visit. I'm not quite sure what they're doing there.
Well, Linda, Stephen explained that he doesn't think beyond the two GCC countries, UAE and Bahrain, that are currently in the Abraham Accords, there's necessarily good reason to think that some of the other GCC states will be officially normalizing with Israel. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this, as well as the prospects for Saudi Arabia entering the Abraham Accords. We know that with King Salman on the throne, that might be unlikely, but after MBS becomes the king, some people are saying it's more likely that Saudi Arabia would normalize with Israel. What are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. And I don't think that Stephen and I disagree on the deliverables aspect of this Biden trip. They're going to be modest. And what I was trying to sketch was a larger strategic opportunity, and really this question of, does the US leave the region and is there no consequence to it? Does the US find a middle path? And I think we certainly know the US isn't going to stay on the path. It's been, I think it's a bipartisan agreement. The path of the last 20 years was overinvestment with too little return on that investment. So it's about the degree of US involvement in the region and the type of that. And I would just say I had very extensive conversations with the Emiratis, who of course have a very detailed idea of the kind of security cooperation agreement they would like to have with the US. And as was well publicized, were quite upset at actions the US took by the failure to redesignate the Houthis, and as other countries as well, this possibility of the delisting of the IRGC, the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, to gain a return to the GCPOA. I think that is dead now. But I think that it is a sign from what I believe the region would like the US to remain and be there, not just because we're a weapons provider of choice, but because the US has a track record of commitment and performance such that China and Russia really don't. And especially China, which is a mercantilistic power and is coming there for its own purposes. Now, I would say the region is diversifying. I think that Chinese and Russia ties, and especially China, are going to continue to grow. But I don't see them replacing the US. It's really about the US, does it pivot away and not realize what is our other major argument in the research that Rand has been doing, is that the Middle East is a huge arena of the so-called great power competition. And if we're not there, we don't compete. And so this is just really a larger question about whether the US intends to play on the world stage or treat the China problem as if it purely occurs in the Asian theater. So I think it's really about a strategic approach by this administration trying to meter what it's doing and the deliverables. I'd like to come back to your very first question, Giorgio. The Democratic congressmen send out a letter of all these things they think that the administration should obtain as far as human rights actions and commitments in return for this extraordinary act of going to Saudi Arabia and really initiating an overt rapprochement in that bilateral relationship. It won't be, I think, enough for the US simply to have a public statement that says we still care about human rights. For this trip to be seen at all as successful, I do believe there needs to be some agreement that there is responsibility taken for the Khashoggi murder, that there will be a commitment to continue the process, because of course Turkey, to have its rapprochement, abandoned its trial and has ceased action to pursue justice there. And there, frankly, in my view, if Saudi Arabia is going to have success in its Vision 2030, it needs to have a wider lens on what liberalization would mean to attract the kind of capital and talent that fulfilling its vision is going to require. It just can't rely on China alone to achieve its goals.
Great, thank you. And Stephen, Linda touched on these issues of great power competition. And I'm wondering, in your opinion, to what extent do you think Biden could successfully use this visit to try to bring Saudi Arabia and some other Arab states back a little closer to Washington's geopolitical orbit and try to convince the Saudis and these other Arab states to sort of slow down in terms of the deepening of their partnerships with China and Russia?
It's a really good question. I don't think that great power competition is a major focus of the visit, although of course it is something that is on everybody's minds, right? It's the new paradigm. But I think that the Gulf countries in particular welcome the American security commitment. What they don't want is that they don't want to be forced to make a choice. They don't want to be forced to make a choice between the United States and Russia on energy, and the United States and China on a whole host of other issues. So let's be clear that oil producing states in the region have a confluence of interest with the Russians on the price of oil. They have more of a confluence interest with Russia on the price of oil than they do with the United States on human rights, for example. So that's why they're going to continue to walk a very fine line with the United States and Russia, particularly as it pertains to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yes, I think you'll see that the Saudis and the Emiratis are going to pump more oil come the fall, because the OPEC Plus agreement will expire, and then there'll be an opportunity to renegotiate it. But they're not rushing necessarily to help the United States at this very moment. They don't really have the capacity, but nevertheless, this is not something that's new. This is not something that is a function of the invasion of Ukraine. Oil prices were spiking well before this geopolitical shock made it more acute. And during that period, Biden was dispatching diplomats to the region and asking the Saudis to pump more oil, and he wasn't getting any joy out of it. So I think that there's certainly on security, people in the region welcome an American commitment. But like I said before, they're going to need something more than words. And a NATO-like commitment is really a non-starter. And that's really what the Emiratis and the Saudis, that's their opening bid. And that's very, very unlikely to happen. When it comes to China, it's really our own unforced errors that are the issue. Look, our interlocutors in the Gulf and the broader region are very sophisticated in terms of the way in which they view the United States and American politics. They see the dysfunction here in Washington. It makes them question our commitment. We show up in the region and we say, we want you to do X, Y, and Z, and plus we want you to pay for it. The Chinese show up and say, we want to invest. And that's something that's deeply attractive to countries. The Emiratis will tell you over and over again, don't badger us about Huawei and 5G unless you have your own alternative. So, like I said, they do not want to be forced into making a choice, because they're not going to make the choice. And that's really the difference between kind of great power competition 2.0. It's one of the differences between great power competition 2.0 and the Cold War. So I think it's something that'll be a lot messier in the Middle East. Certainly the Russians I see as a much more malevolent actor in the region, whereas the Chinese are, as Linda said, essentially mercantilist and don't want to take sides, which is pretty much okay with everybody else in the region except for us.
Can I just make
Linda, please jump in. Please.
Yes, thank you. I think that it's important to recognize, though, there are a lot of companies that don't want to do business, and certainly U.S. government has deep concerns around Chinese technology, and there are interests of the Gulf countries and others, and we've been through this, of course, with Israel as well, that what the countries would like may be inhibited a bit by some of the things going on with China and Chinese theft of intellectual property, the espionage issues, and U.S. security concerns that revolve around that. So I think that it's just, and what Anwar Gargash told me, he says, look, we will be happy to entertain the concerns and address them. And certainly we would prefer your platforms to the Chinese ones. So I think that it's really about a dialogue. And I think that actually the Emiratis understand there's no Article 5 NATO commitment there. They did not, they understand that, but it's about understanding in what cases, in what threats the US is prepared to do what things. And I think this comes to, and Stephen, I should congratulate you on your Saudi special report. It's very well done. And I think it comes down to really, what are the agreements that make sense for the US to make to shore up security concerns of those in the region without enabling offensive activities, foreign adventures, proxy warfares, but build up a sense as the Iranian threat continues, and it is a real concern, to enable these countries to provide for their necessary defense. And that, I think, should be the focus here of the broader policy community's conversation, is what does right look like there? Because there are hard trade-offs, and it's just not a matter of saying, give us something on Khashoggi, get forward on the Yemen peace negotiations, which is a tough nut. There has to be a real understanding about what a security umbrella would look like, and that it be defensive in nature and not provocative. And we haven't really talked to Iran, and I'll turn it back to you, Giorgio, because you probably want to have a word about Iran, because that is, I think, front and center. Thank you.
I just want to add one thing. I think what the administration is aiming for is what people refer to as offshore balancing, which is not, necessarily a bad idea, but it tends to work better in academic journals than it does in reality. We have tried offshore balancing before, and it ended in failure. It was called the Nixon Doctrine, and it played out in the Middle East by supporting the Shah of Iran, who subsequently fell, and supporting the Saudi ability to Saudi Arabia's internal stability, which turned out to be problematic after the siege of Mecca in 1979. So it didn't work out all that well. And, there is a risk. There's a risk to every policy. There's a risk to providing regional actors with the tools to defend themselves in the hope that they establish a regional balance. Because sometimes that they won't. They'll do things that will upset that balance. So one of the big reasons why we're there and why we've been there, and the overinvestment that actually began in 1991, is because those countries have not been able to establish a balance. So let's be clear, a middle road may be what the Biden administration is aiming for, but there are significant downside risks to it. I think it's probably a better option than withdrawal or maintaining what we're doing now. But we also need to recognize that there's significant risks to this new paradigm that everybody seems to be very enthusiastic about, and giving the Saudis, the Emiratis, and everybody else all this equipment.
But you yourself have called with your report calls for a compact with Saudi Arabia. So you're making that argument yourself.
It does, but we also say it's an extremely tall order. And we also say that there are downside risks to it.
Yes.
Thank you. Linda, I wanted to turn to the JCPOA. Obviously, within the GCC, different member states don't all have the same views on the nuclear accord. As you recall, in May 2018, 3 of the GCC states, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, were very pleased with Trump's decision to pull out of the JCPOA unilaterally. But also we know from Oman, Qatar, and Kuwait, there are also some countries in the GCC that believe it would be in their interests for the US and the other parties to revive the JCPOA. Nonetheless, it seems like there's very little reason to be optimistic about the JCPOA being revived. And if we're moving to a post-JCPOA future, how do you think this will impact US relations with the 6 GCC countries? Or if you maybe want to address Washington's relationship with even just one of the GCC countries, that would be excellent.
Yes, thank you, Giorgio. And I'm glad we're getting to this really important topic, which I think is going to be a part of the closed door conversations. Again, not necessarily an agreement popping out the end, but absolutely these countries have to prepare for the likelihood there won't be a return to the JCPOA. And the big strategic concerns, I would say, are two. One is that Saudi Arabia decides that Iran is a nuclear threshold state, is going to go for developing the bomb and not just using the threat of that, and pursues its own nuclear path. That would be extremely dangerous, destabilizing, game-changing. And the US is obviously going to want to have those discussions. The other one is that Israel will continue and ramp up the actions it's taking now, because it is absolutely convinced that it needs to take action to prevent that eventuality of Iran taking the step of developing and putting on a nuclear warhead on a device. So we need to, I think, understand just how dire the situation is. And there isn't, even if there were to return to the JCPOA as it is, the sunset is so short that one must begin to look ahead. Is there another diplomatic gambit to get a renewal of the diplomatic process to have a follow-on agreement, or does it simply revert back to constraining, deterring, and again, trying to unite the region around a set of actions that are not destabilizing, which is what I think both Saudi's nuclear bid would be destabilizing, and Israel, those scenarios, I was just in a simulation this week, those scenarios get to be very troubling as well. So I think we have to have a more concerted effort by the US administration to lead on this policy and try to get its partners in the region to come on board.
Thank you. Stephen, I wanted to ask you, when Biden is in Israel, will he be addressing the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and the Israeli response to that war? Obviously, Israel has deep ties to Russia, and I think at the beginning of the conflict, after the shock of February 24, there were many in Washington who were disappointed with how Israel responded to that conflict. But I think over the past few months, many analysts agree that Israel has shifted a little closer to the US position in relation to the conflict in Ukraine. Could you please tell us how you think this war in Eastern Europe is going to possibly come up when Israel is in Israel?
Well, I don't think this is going to be a public part of the president's visit. This is the presidential visit to Israel is really about the pomp and circumstance and playing to constituencies back home. The president's going to visit an Iron Dome site and other areas of importance that will underline what he will say is an ironclad American commitment to Israeli security. So I think as long as the Israelis have been moving in the direction of the United States, it's not something that I think the president wants to have a fight with the Israelis over. The Israeli position has evolved. They've had strategic concerns. Obviously, they don't want they believe that they need the Russians to allow them to use the airspace how they have wanted to use the airspace against the Iranians in Syria. And they're worried that as long as this conflict continues and the Russians will be distracted, that the Iranians will fill the void of the Russians, and then the Iranians will be their neighbors. And so that was really the reason for the kind of ambiguous Israeli policy with regard to the invasion. I think too many people made like a bigger deal of the fact that there's a large kind of Russian population in Israel. It was mostly strategic concerns. But of course, as the Russians have done some pretty terrible things with regard to the Russian Jewish community and things that Sergei Lavrov have said, the Israelis have begun to rethink it. And of course, then Foreign Minister Yair Lapid was much more sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause than was Prime Minister Bennett. And now Lapid, at least for the interim, is the prime minister. So I think we'll continue to see an evolution, but there's not going to be a fight between the United States and Israel over the question of Ukraine. And I think that the sort of emphasis on it, and Adam Kinzinger's tweet about it is really ancillary to the fact that there is a huge war in Europe right now, and that Israel is a long way away, and the emphasis on Israel's position on it seems to me misplaced. The Gulf countries, there's a different story there because of how they play in the energy markets. I think the Israeli position is largely ancillary.
Thank you. Linda, please go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to add, I think it's very well understood also that Israel has to factor in the very proximate presence of Russian systems in Syria, and that they have been carrying out actions against Iran, against Hezbollah, with really the sufferance of the Russian government. So I think they're very much, and I think the U.S. understands that Israel is protecting itself in that very close fight, and it has those interests that it has to put above doing more on the Russian front. But I think as Stephen was saying, it's different for the Gulf and the Arab countries, the Gulf countries in particular. And I think this is actually where there's a huge amount of anger and frustration on the Hill and among others, that this is a front and center global test of allowing Russia to do what it's doing and to not have more overt expressions of support and actions in support, I think rubs people the wrong way vis-a-vis the Gulf.
Thank you. Stephen, I want to turn it back to you. Today is Tuesday, and let's say at 5 p.m. your phone rings and it's Joe Biden, and he's asking you for some advice. And he wants to know, Stephen, what is the advice that you give to him as he's going to be going into the Middle East this week?
Joe from Scranton calling me. No, look, what I'd say to him is, I think that you could have done all of the business that you're planning on doing from Washington. I think, you should absolutely avoid all of the traps that you are going to confront. And I think that you have to be realistic about those traps. And I wouldn't go, turn around. It strikes me that there's no compelling reason for the president to go. All of the processes that Linda underlined as important for the United States are already happening. And I think that it undercuts the president's commitments on a variety of other issues for him to go. That's not to say that the United States should be leaving the Middle East. I'm on record advocating that the whole idea of withdrawal is kind of silly. But we do need to keep in mind what's important to the United States. And I think that we kind of get carried away with these visits that we're going to do everything and anything. It's about human rights. It's about oil. It's about great power competition. It's about Iran. It's about, well, what is it that's important to the United States? And that, I think, is one of the problems that we've run into over the course of the last 3 decades or so, is that we're too ambitious for what we wanted to do. When it comes to Iran, containment and deterrence is perhaps the best way to go. Getting back into the JCPOA, which at this point is this kind of Rube Goldberg contraption that's too complicated, and the Iranians are so close anyway that it doesn't really make difference, is really driven mostly by Biden's domestic Biden's domestic politics. There's no follow-on agreement with the Iranians. The Iranians don't want a new relationship with the United States. So deterrence and containment is really the best is the best opportunity for us with regard to that. And our relationship with Israel will continue to be as it is, although it is increasingly doesn't make a lot of sense given Israel's the fact that Israel has thrived over many, many years. I have a book coming out that makes these kinds of arguments. So there are very specific things that the United States can be doing in the short term in terms of energy security, and we seem to be doing those things. But I think that the current visit doesn't make a lot of sense.
Linda, Stephen says the current visit doesn't make a lot of sense. And when Biden is going to call Stephen later this afternoon, his advice will be don't go.
Just go to Rehoboth Beach this weekend.
Just go to Delaware.
Yeah, wherever he goes, and dispense with the whole idea of going to the Middle East.
Is this the advice that Biden would get from you if he gives you a call today as well?
Come on, that's a loaded question, Giorgio. That's not the advice Linda's going to give.
When President Biden calls me, I will tell him absolutely the symbolism of a visit is important because everyone in the region believes the U.S. is leaving. This narrative has taken hold, and the speeches at the Manama dialogue that Brett McGurk and Secretary Austin gave were far from adequate. They need to really spell out the vision of what they are prepared to do and not prepared to do in a way that addresses the real concerns. And the focus is and should be regional security cooperation. We're going to do this collectively. The US isn't going to do it for you. There isn't going to be a blank check. And it's important to have a broad view of security. It's not just about military threats. If the region does not get serious about climate and water issues, those are drivers of conflict. And so I think there's a very important message, and the leaders have complained that it's very hard to get people on the phone. So showing up, answering calls is an important part of it, and the administration needs to give due time in its portfolio to the region. So it's a chance to really demonstrate that.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I wish we were able to ask more questions and continue the discussion, but nonetheless, I wanted to thank our two experts, Linda Robinson and Stephen Cook, for joining us. I wanted to thank CEO of American Security Project, Patrick Costello, for putting this together and facilitating it, and everyone at the ASP team. And also I wanted to thank everyone who joined us. I hope that after Biden comes back from the Middle East, we'll have another chance to continue discussing some of these issues. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Giorgio. Keep running with the devil. Thanks.
Thank you, Giorgio and Steve. Have a great day.